Hello Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. This is part 2 in our series on rape culture, so if you missed part 1, there is a link in the description below. But if you're all caught up, let's just get started with our big question this time. What is rape culture? What do people mean when they say that we live in one? And it's basically the charge that America has a culture that very broadly permits and encourages rape. And that's a very confusing charge to a lot of people, because rape still is, and generally has been for a very, very long time, a moral touchstone in our culture. In other words, when everybody agrees that rape is wrong, there's not really any debate about that. When somebody starts spouting moral relativism, for example, and they say that there's no such thing as right and wrong, and it's all relative, and it's right for you, it's wrong for me, and so on and so forth. The two most common rejoinders to that are always, well, what about Hitler? There's no right and wrong when it comes to Hitler. And of course, the second one is well, what about rape? There's no right and wrong when it comes to rape. And we do that because, as morally confused as our culture is, those are the two things that just about everybody with a pulse can agree on. Hitler is evil, rape is wrong. There's very little disagreement on that. It's never 100%, and there's always the 5 to 10% of people who will believe just about anything. But it is as close to a consensus as it's possible for sinful human beings to really achieve. But that does raise an obvious question. If we as a culture universally condemn rape, how can we say that we live in a culture that permits and encourages rape? How does that work out? How can you reconcile those two things? And the big difficulty there is that there has been a very significant change in the way that we talk about rape, and it all surrounds this idea of consent. Whenever feminists speak about rape today, it's always defined as some form of sexual contact without the victim's consent. Whereas you look back 100 years ago, or even less, even a generation or so ago, the language would be more along the lines of sex against their will, which is different. And that's a side effect of the sexual revolution. People basically want to throw out all of traditional sexual morality and replace it with the idea that everything is okay as long as it's consensual. The goal being to legitimize the illicit sex that you want to have, but still be able to condemn rape, because nobody wants that, obviously. But that change really altered the way that we look at rape as well. Because without consent and against the will, those are two things that are very, very similar, but there are some really important differences there. Key being that against the will is a much thicker concept to work with. There's just more there because our wills are always active. They're always doing, they're always enfleshed in our behavior. And determining what a person wills, it's a very multifaceted thing. It touches on their relationships, on their desires, on their circumstances, on the reasonable social expectations around them, and especially on their behavior in the midst of all these things. Whereas consent, on the other hand, is much thinner. It's permission. Nothing more, nothing less. And that's a very narrow concept on which to hinge all of sexual morality, which is what they were attempting to do. And let me illustrate the difference here in a different context. A few years ago, somebody went down our road and they were hitting mailboxes on our side of the road with a baseball bat or something. I didn't see it happen, but I got up and saw the giant dents in everybody's mailbox down the line. And ours was damaged very badly. It couldn't be salvaged, so I had to go out and buy a new mailbox. And our neighbor's mailbox was actually knocked off the post altogether, and their mail had spilled out into the ditch, into the drainage ditch. And so I decided, well, since I was already fixing the post and I was already remounting our mailbox on there, I'll just pick up our neighbor's mailbox, and I'll reattach to the post. I'll get their mail out of the ditch, and I'll let it dry off. And the thing is, I did all of that without my neighbor's consent, because I never asked permission. I couldn't, because they were out of town at the time. And I went ahead and did it anyway, because even though I didn't have consent, it was by no means against their will, because what I did was entirely aligned with their straightforward interests. And they were certainly better off, and there would be no question on their part that they were better off. And any intrusion into their affairs was purely superficial. It's no worse than when the mailman puts their mail into our mailbox, which he does a lot. And that doesn't mean that consent doesn't matter, because it does, but it matters much less than will. Because at the end of the day, consent is merely one way among many in which we express our will. So that's a big difference there. Without consent, much narrower than against the will. And on top of that, it gets worse because consent is at the same time being dehumanized in the way that we talk about it. And I say dehumanized because feminists in particular are deliberately trying to cleave the idea of consent away from any other kind of normal human consideration. It's the idea that consent has to be pure. It can't be affected by any other factors, can't be influenced by anything from the outside, not by social expectations or present or prior relationships, certainly not by anything along the lines of chastity or marriage, and can't be affected by anything else. And the first popular version of consent that I encountered was the old no means no standard. Idea being, if a woman says no, that's it. No, there's no interpretations there. Always and without exception, if she says no, that's it. And that was standard for a while. But as people used it more, they found that it just wasn't good enough because the standard didn't cover a lot of behavior that people would normally consider to be rape. For example, if somebody's drugged and they'd be unable to say no, but if somebody took advantage of that, that would certainly still be rape. Or in instances of, some kind of unsolicited groping, like some of the allegations against Bill Clinton. Again, if that just happens out of the blue, well, she might not say no until afterward. And, would that be some kind of sexual assault? And people actually defended President Clinton along those lines, saying that, well, she didn't say no until afterward, and once he did, he stopped, so everything's fine. So people eventually realized no means no really doesn't cut it when it comes to describing rape. So what we're finding now is people moving more towards the affirmative consent standard. And last I checked, this was passed in 7 states, under consideration in 22 more. I'm not sure exactly where that stands now. But with affirmative consent, rather than no means no, it's that only yes means yes. So it doesn't, whether or not a person says no, that doesn't affect whether there's consent or not. She actually has to say yes for consent to exist. It can't be assumed in any way. From California's new law, lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent, nor does silence mean consent. So it always has to be some kind of active, positive, and generally a verbal yes in order for consent to be considered to be present. From another place in that same law, affirmative consent must be ongoing throughout a sexual activity, and it can be revoked at any time. So at any point during the sexual encounter, consent can be taken away, and the sexual encounter would then become rape then, if it continued. But because a lack of protest or resistance or silence, because none of those actually mean consent, the revocation doesn't actually have to be communicated to the other person. If the other person stops actively saying yes at any point during the encounter, it becomes rape. And even the advocates of that's very broad. Even the advocates of these laws will admit that there's really no way to demonstrate your innocence under a law like that, because there's always going to be some kind of gap in between yeses, in which case, well, consent can't be assumed there. And other affirmative consent policies, they go even further. They will require new consent at each escalation of the encounter. So consent just at the beginning doesn't count if what you're doing changes. You have to have a new consent. It has to be renewed. So, yeah, new consent at each escalation, but I've never yet seen one that really defines what an escalation is during a sexual encounter. I mean, we're talking about first, second, and third base. Are those legal categories now? When you change positions, is that an escalation? Or even things like harder and faster, would those be escalations? And so all of these details, they hinge the legal definition of rape on some very, very vague language, and on language that's really easy to abuse, because the outcome of this is essentially to criminalize all sexual activity if it is reported, if there's an accusation along with it. So if you're accused and the sexual contact happened, then you're effectively guilty. From that point forward, there's no way to prove innocence. And there's certainly no way to presume innocence in a case like that. And that's a very, very arbitrary power to grant people. Very easy to abuse. But even this, for a lot of people, even this is still not good enough. The latest proposals that I keep hearing are to make consent work is only an enthusiastic yes means yes. So only yes means yes, not good enough. It has to be an enthusiastic yes. Meaning that even if they expressly give consent, if they expressly say yes or okay, it doesn't count unless they're really, really into it. And this kind of came to light with the story about Aziz Ansari. He was a comedian who had what sounded like a fairly awkward sexual encounter with a woman. And she then wrote a high-profile complaint about it. And according to her account, everything that they did, she did consent to. But she didn't really want to do it. She didn't really want to be there. She just wasn't that into him. And he ended up being a big controversy about that. So with only enthusiastic yes means yes, consent can't even be a wholly deliberate choice, because deliberation is normally in response to other factors, and it can be in response to social pressures. So the only yes that's good enough is the yes that has to proceed from emotional excitement, which basically reduces consent all the way down to just whim. That sex is okay if you feel like it, but if you don't feel like it, it is rape, with no real middle ground going on there. So essentially, if you've ever had mediocre sex, you are guilty of rape, according to these kinds of policies. And believe it or not, it does actually get weirder even than that. I have a new most ridiculous commentary on consent story here. My old favorite used to be somebody who was writing about how rapey Christmas is because, God just had his way with this young virgin's womb. Sure, Mary agreed. She even sang a song about it. That's where we get the Magnificat from. But that was only after not being asked, but being told by a powerful, supernatural being what was going to happen to her. So essentially her consent wasn't pure enough because of the power differential, because God influenced her decision to say yes, which is truly a terrible violation, one that's second only to his unilateral creation of her in the first place without so much as a by-year leave. So that's pretty ridiculous. But my new favorite is one I read over this past summer, where somebody's arguing that parents need to seek their baby's consent before changing their diapers. And I'm not kidding about that. That is actually what they were arguing. The idea, she didn't exactly expect the babies to say yes, but the idea was to train them in the proper notions of consent from the youngest age possible. And anybody who's actually been a parent will tell you that that does not work, at least doesn't work with all kids. My youngest, if we sought his consent before changing his diaper, that would not be particularly hygienic. And examples like that, those are extreme, definitely, but they do illustrate the same trend towards making consent more and more like whim by deliberately purging it of what would ordinarily be normal human considerations. The baby one, of course, removes the normal parent-child relationship from the equation. The Christmas one, it removes a normal God creation relationship. But the key problem with those is not the extremity, because no means no. That's certainly the least extreme of all these different versions of consent. But even that has some problems in that it discards certain normal parts of human interactions, romantic interactions. For example, a woman's inclination to be coy or modest, or a man's inclination to be persistent in response to coyness or modesty. I mean, if you think of romance as a dance, that would be a normal step in the whole thing. And it just naturally results from the differences in male and female behavior. You know, not every relationship is like that, but it's certainly not abnormal to have that dynamic in a romantic relationship. And if you forbid that dynamic, which is what the no means no standard would have to do, then that can cause relationship problems. For example, say a husband approaches his wife with romantic intent, as Hank Hill put it, and she responds by coyly discouraging his advances, either explicitly or implicitly saying no. And so he does as he's been taught his whole life, and he just immediately gives up. And this happens over and over again, because every time they want to start something, she does what comes naturally to her. And he does what he has been taught is absolutely essential to avoid committing, one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. And as this keeps going on over and over again, he starts getting resentful. Because from his perspective, she's perpetually withholding sex from him. She's just saying no all the time. Even though the reality is that, well, she's just being coy because she wants to be pursued. But she starts getting resentful too, because from her perspective, he either will not or cannot fight for her. He won't put any effort into pursuing her because he's just acting entitled. And he's just, expecting her to just put out on demand. Even though in reality, he's just being respectful of her wishes, like he's been taught to do his whole life. So even no means no, which is not an extreme standard, even that really damages normal human behavior because it removes this category of, I want you to convince me, from the realm of human sexuality altogether. So even that does damage. Even there's a really big difference between against the will and without consent. So this difference between the two, especially the difference between against the will and dehumanized consent, this radically alters normal sexual behavior. Because, quite frankly, in most healthy marital relationships, consent is much more often implied or communicated through things like body language or even just assumed, rather than explicitly sought and granted with some kind of, ongoing, explicitly positive verbal yes. Because, constantly asking permission for everything, that just isn't romantic. Imagine actually trying to adhere to an affirmative consent standard from start to finish during a sexual encounter. Two computers will work that way. They'll negotiate a data transfer by explicitly, stating their intention and requesting permission from the other device, and sending packets back and forth to confirm each step in the process. But nobody wants their relationship to actually look like the relationship between two computers. It just does not work that way with human beings. It's not what anybody really wants. And if you cut off consent from every other human consideration, then all you're doing is making this legalism out of mere whim. So sex is okay if and only if they really, really feel like it. And lest you think that this is an irrelevant example, that nobody would ever, go that far. Not too long ago, I read an op-ed in the New York Times by a woman who was trying to have a hookup with her Tinder date, and he was literally asking her, "Is this okay?" at every article of clothing. And so she complains about it in the New York Times, and she says to him, "I invited a guy from Tinder to my empty apartment on a snow day. Let's just assume you have blanket consent here." And her complaints go further, too. She says, "Something else about his asking also made me uneasy. It seemed legalistic and self-protective, imported more from the courtroom than from a true sense of caretaking. And each time he asked, it was as if he assumed I lacked the agency to say no on my own." So, again, even in hookups, nobody really wants to follow this. Nobody actually wants the other person to follow an affirmative consent standard because it's just not the way normal humans interact. And it's certainly essential to respect one another's wills. when it comes to sex, and consent does play a role in that. But it is not essential to always respect one another's whims when it comes to sex. And so, as the nature of our social and sexual relationships starts to break down, and this really thin and dehumanized version of consent is the only factor we're allowed to consider when we make moral judgments about sex, well, it starts getting really, really hard to sort out what is going wrong and what is wrong in different sexual encounters. And that is what we are going to talk about next time. So please like, comment, subscribe, share the video, and join us next time when we are going to start considering the very broad category of behaviors that fall into this bucket of sexual assault, and how that contributes to our understanding of rape culture.